Here I want to look at a very, very simple example of how to use JavaScript to request the return of data. In this case, it's going to be from a simple text file that's stored on site. So here's the page running on my website. It's just got a link, say hello, I click it, and it displays hello world. It looks pretty simple, but there's quite a lot going on behind the scenes. Here's the web page, helloworld.html. And also on the website, I've got this data file, which is just a text file, hello.txt, and it contains the string, the text, hello world. So in order to display that text, the JavaScript has to make a request to the web server. The web server goes and then responds to the request and returns the data. So that's why this has to run on site. It can't just be loaded from your file system on your local computer. An XML HTTP request object is usually initialized by calling the XML HTTP request method. However, older versions of Microsoft's Internet Explorer web browser didn't support that method, and instead, a request object was returned as a result of creating an ActiveX object with a string argument Microsoft.xml_HTTP. And even today, in order to ensure backward compatibility with older web browsers, with older versions of Internet Explorer, it's still quite commonplace for JavaScript to test if the user's browser is Internet Explorer, that is, if it supports ActiveX object, and if so, to create the request object like this. Now, the request object has a ready state property, and that property changes as the request is handled. And when it changes, the onReadyState change event is triggered, and that allows me to designate a named method as an event handler, that is, a handler for the event that's triggered, which here is the showHello message method. And the readyState property of the request object can have values between 0 and 4, and these values indicate the status of the request as follows. 0, the request isn't initialized, open has not been called. 1, the request has been opened but not sent, so send has not been called. 2, the request has been sent but no data has been returned yet. 3, the request is being processed but it's not yet complete. And 4, the request is complete and all the data has now been received. The sayHello function checks the ready state of the request object before sending the request. And it's good practice to check that the request is neither uninitialized, that's 0, nor complete, that's 4. And that being so, I can use the request to open the file hello.txt using request.open and get the data from it. Here the third parameter, true, shows that the request should be handled asynchronously. Remember, asynchronous is the first A in AJAX, so that the web page doesn't seize up if it has to wait for data to be returned. Asynchronous requests permit other activities to continue while the request is being processed, so large data files can be loaded, if you like, in the background. Now, the call to send then sends the request to the server. The code needs to respond to that request once it's been completed, that is, when its ready state is 4, and that's done in the designated event handler function, showHelloMSG, which displays the results of the request, that's the response text property, in the named div. And at the end of all that, just to remind you, this is what I get. So, you might think it's an awful lot of work for very little in the way of a result. And you would be absolutely correct. This is a very basic example of how to use AJAX to retrieve data, and in the next video I'm going to show you something more useful when we start processing an XML data file.